In the musty depths of Miskatonic University's library, where shadows danced like sentient specters across weathered tomes, Professor Edward Blackwood found himself ensnared by an insidious curiosity. His trembling fingers, stained with ink and the dust of forgotten ages, clutched a manuscript so ancient that its very existence seemed to defy the natural laws of decay. The parchment, yellow and brittle as autumn leaves, bore symbols that writhed beneath his gaze, an alphabet unknown to any earthly civilization. Blackwood's heart raced, a primal fear coursing through his veins as he realized the magnitude of his discovery. This was no mere academic pursuit. He stood at the precipice of knowledge man was never meant to possess. As the library's ancient clock tolled midnight, its somber chimes reverberating through the cavernous halls, Blackwood made a decision that would seal his fate. With furtive glances over his shoulder, he slipped the manuscript into his satchel, the weight of his theft pressing upon his conscience like a leaden shroud. Little did he know that as he hurried through the fog-shrouded streets of Arkham, something stirred in the spaces between reality, an entity older than time itself, roused from its eldritch slumber by the mere touch of mortal hands upon its long-buried secrets. In the sanctum of his study, as Blackwood unfurled the manuscript beneath the flickering light of a gas lamp, the first whispers of madness began to echo in the recesses of his mind. The pursuit of forbidden knowledge had begun, and with it, the unraveling of Edward Blackwood's sanity, and perhaps the very fabric of reality itself. Days melted into nights, the boundaries of time blurring as Blackwood immersed himself in the cryptic text. His once tidy study now resembled a mad artist's atelier, walls plastered with sketches of alien geometries, floors strewn with crumpled papers bearing half-formed translations. The professor's eyes, bloodshot and wild, darted between the manuscript and his feverish notes. It was on the 7th night, or was it the 70th, that Blackwood's quill scratched out a word that seemed to resonate with an otherworldly vibration. Yidhra. As the name took form on the page, the candles flickered, and a chill wind swept through the room, though no window was open. Blackwood felt a presence behind him, a weight pressing against the fabric of reality. He dared not turn, for fear of what his eyes might behold. Instead, he focused on the manuscript, his hand moving of its own accord, translating passages that spoke of a civilization lost to time and space. "In the court of Yidhra, where angles bend and time flows like water," he muttered, his voice a hoarse whisper, "there dwell beings whose very existence defies comprehension." A low hum filled the air, growing in intensity with each word he translated. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, reaching out with tendrils of darkness. Blackwood's rational mind screamed for him to stop, to burn the manuscript and forget this madness. But the allure of knowledge, the siren song of secrets long buried, was too strong to resist. As dawn broke, casting sickly gray light through the curtains, Blackwood slumped over his desk, exhausted. But even in his fitful dreams, the name Yidhra echoed, and visions of impossible cities and writhing tentacles plagued his slumber. He had taken the first step on a path from which there could be no return, a journey into realms where the light of reason feared to tread. As weeks passed, Professor Blackwood's colleagues at Miskatonic University began to whisper. The once brilliant scholar now wandered the halls like a wraith, his clothes disheveled, his eyes sunken and feverish. He muttered incomprehensible phrases, scribbling strange symbols on any surface he could find. In his lectures, Blackwood veered off into wild tangents about non-Euclidean geometry and the malleability of time. Students shifted uncomfortably in their seats as he ranted about the court of Yidhra and the folly of human perception. When confronted by the dean, Blackwood merely smiled, a rictus grin that never reached his haunted eyes, and promised to unlock the secrets that would reshape reality itself. But it was in the solitude of night that the true horror unfolded. As Blackwood pored over the manuscript, the whispers began. At first he dismissed them as the product of an overworked mind, yet they grew louder, more insistent, echoing from the shadows of his study. "Yidhra calls," they hissed, a cacophony of voices that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The veil thins. The way opens. Blackwood clutched his head, trying to shut out the maddening chorus. But with each passing night the voices grew stronger, more alluring. They promised knowledge beyond mortal ken, power to bend the very fabric of existence. One particularly dark night, as a storm raged outside, Blackwood found himself standing before his full-length mirror. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in stark, electric clarity. For a brief moment, the reflection that stared back at him was not his own. A figure of impossible angles and writhing appendages occupied the glass, its form constantly shifting, defying the laws of physics and sanity alike. Blackwood screamed, stumbling backward. When he looked again, his own haggard face had returned. But now, in the corner of his vision, shapes moved in the shadows. Tentacles of darkness reached for him, only to recede when he turned to face them directly. "I must be going mad," Blackwood whispered, his voice trembling. But even as he spoke the words, a part of him knew the truth. He wasn't losing his grip on reality. Reality itself was unraveling around him. With shaking hands, he returned to the manuscript. The symbols seemed to crawl across the page, rearranging themselves into new and terrible configurations. As he traced his fingers over the alien script, Blackwood felt a surge of eldritch energy course through him. The whispers crescendoed, and for a moment he glimpsed a vista of impossible cities and vast, starless voids. "Yidhra," he breathed, the name both a prayer and a curse. "Show me more." And in the depths of the cosmos, something ancient and unfathomable stirred, its attention fixed upon the mortal who dared to speak its name. The line between waking and dreaming blurred for Professor Blackwood as autumn gave way to a bitter winter. His nights were filled with visions of vast alien landscapes where the laws of physics bent and broke. In these dreams, he wandered through cities of non-Euclidean architecture, their spires twisting into skies of impossible colors. Creatures of tentacles and eyes regarded him with eldritch curiosity, their thoughts pressing against his consciousness like a cold, slimy tendril. But it was the waking world that truly began to terrify him. Blackwood noticed subtle changes in his environment, shadows that lingered too long, reflections that moved independently of their owners, and the constant maddening hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls of his home. One morning, as he prepared for his increasingly sporadic lectures, Blackwood caught sight of his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He recoiled in horror. His skin had taken on a sickly greenish pallor, and his eyes were no longer his own. Pupils had expanded to consume the iris, leaving depthless black orbs that seemed to contain swirling galaxies within. "What's happening to me?" he whispered, his voice cracking with fear and a strange underlying excitement. As if in response, the whispers that had become his constant companions grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of metamorphosis, of shedding the limitations of human flesh to embrace a higher form of existence. Blackwood stumbled to his study, clutching the manuscript like a lifeline. The symbols on the page writhed and pulsated, seeming to leap off the parchment and dance in the air around him. With trembling hands, he began to translate a new passage. "In the realm of Yidhra, flesh is but clay to be molded. Those who drink deep of her wisdom shall cast off their mortal shells and become as gods." As he spoke the words aloud, Blackwood felt a searing pain course through his body. He fell to his knees, watching in fascinated horror as his fingers elongated, the skin between them webbing slightly. The pain intensified, and he screamed, a sound that started human but ended in an otherworldly shriek that shattered the windows of his study. Outside, a group of students passing by heard the inhuman cry. They rushed to the professor's house, pounding on the door. "Professor Blackwood, are you all right? We're calling for help." Inside, Blackwood dragged himself to the door, his newly transformed body responding in ways he didn't yet understand. He knew he couldn't let anyone see him like this. As he reached for the lock, he caught sight of his reflection in a nearby mirror. What stared back was no longer entirely human. "No," he croaked, his voice a raspy whisper. "No help, I'm fine, go away." But even as he spoke, he felt the changes continuing, his very essence shifting into something other. The manuscript lay open on the floor, its pages turning of their own accord, beckoning him back to continue his transformation. In that moment, Edward Blackwood stood at a crossroads. Part of him yearned to open the door, to cry out for help and cling to his humanity. but a growing, alien part of his mind whispered of the power and knowledge that awaited him if he continued down this dark path. With a shuddering breath, he made his choice. Ignoring the frantic knocking at his door, Professor Blackwood turned away, his altered form lurching back towards the manuscript. As he moved, he left a trail of viscous, iridescent fluid that seemed to eat away at the floorboards, leaving tiny geometrical patterns in its wake. The pounding at the door faded, replaced by the sound of sirens in the distance. But Blackwood was beyond caring about such mundane concerns now. His entire being was focused on the manuscript, its pages now glowing with an unearthly light. As he read, the walls of his study began to warp and twist. Reality itself seemed to bend around him, the familiar contours of his home stretching and contracting like a living thing. Blackwood felt as if he were standing at the center of a maelstrom, the eye of a storm that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of existence. "The gates of Yidhra's realm lie not in space but in the mind," he read aloud, his voice a chorus of whispers and inhuman tones. "To cross the threshold, one must sacrifice that which binds them to the world of flesh." Understanding dawned on Blackwood, terrible and exhilarating. He knew what he had to do. With hands that were now more tentacle than human, he reached for a small knife on his desk, a relic from an archaeological dig years ago. Outside, the police had arrived. Their shouts mingled with the concerned cries of students and colleagues who had gathered, drawn by the commotion. But inside Blackwood's study, all was eerily quiet save for the constant, maddening hum that had become the soundtrack to his descent into cosmic horror. Blackwood raised the knife, its ancient blade catching the eldritch light that now filled the room. Without hesitation, he plunged it into his chest, expecting pain, but feeling only a rush of liberation. Instead of blood, a torrent of squirming, shadowy shapes poured from the wound. They coalesced around him, forming a cocoon of writhing darkness. As his consciousness began to fade, Blackwood heard the splintering of wood, the police breaking down his door. But it was too late. The threshold had been crossed. In the moment before he lost all connection to his earthly form, Blackwood saw the door burst open. He caught a glimpse of horrified faces, colleagues, students, officers, as they took in the nightmare scene before them. Their screams seemed to come from a great distance, muffled and distorted. One of the officers, driven by some instinct of self-preservation, raised his gun and fired at the pulsating mass of shadows that had once been Edward Blackwood. The bullets passed through harmlessly, lodging in the far wall. As consciousness slipped away, Blackwood felt himself being pulled across vast gulfs of space and time. The last thing he heard before the human world faded entirely was a voice, ancient, vast, and terribly alien, whispering, "Welcome, Seeker, your journey begins." And then Edward Blackwood, once a respected professor at Miskatonic University, vanished from the world of men, leaving behind a room of cosmic horror and a manuscript that pulsed with dark purpose. In the days that followed Professor Blackwood's disappearance, a pall of dread settled over Miskatonic University. The police investigation yielded more questions than answers, leaving authorities baffled and the academic community shaken to its core. Detective Robert Holloway, a veteran of Arkham's police force, stood in the center of Blackwood's study, his face ashen. The room bore little resemblance to the orderly academic space it had once been. Books lay strewn about, their pages covered in scrawled symbols that hurt the eyes to look upon. The walls were marred with strange, undulating patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of one's eye. But it was the manuscript that truly unnerved him. It sat on Blackwood's desk, innocuous at first glance, but radiating an aura of wrongness that made Holloway's skin crawl. "Don't touch that," warned Dr. Armitage, the head librarian of Miskatonic University. The old man had insisted on being present during the investigation, citing the sensitive nature of Blackwood's work. "Some knowledge is not meant for mortal minds." Holloway scoffed, though there was little humor in it. "With all due respect, Doctor, we have a missing person and a room that looks like it hosted some kind of ritual. I need answers." As if in response to his words, a cold wind swept through the room despite all windows being closed. The pages of the manuscript fluttered, and for a moment, Holloway could have sworn he saw something move within the text itself. Dr. Armitage moved with surprising speed for his age, slamming the manuscript shut. "This is beyond your jurisdiction, Detective. There are forces at work here that your laws cannot contain." Before Holloway could protest, one of his junior officers burst into the room, his face pale. "Sir, you need to see this." In the bathroom adjacent to the study, they found a scene that defied explanation. The mirror was shattered, its fragments scattered across the floor. But each shard reflected not the bathroom, but a different, alien landscape. Vistas of impossible geometry and colors that had no place in the natural world. As they watched in horror, a tentacle-like appendage slithered across one of the fragments, leaving a trail of phosphorescent slime. Holloway stumbled back, his rational mind struggling to process what he had seen. "What in God's name—" "Not God," Dr. Armitage interjected gravely. "Something far older and far more dangerous." The old librarian turned to Holloway, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and grim determination. "Detective, I need you to listen carefully. What happened here, what's still happening, is beyond the scope of your investigation. For your own sanity and for the safety of this town, you need to step away." Holloway wanted to argue, to insist that the law must be upheld. But as he looked around the room at the shifting patterns on the walls and the mirror shards that showed impossible worlds, he felt his resolve crumble. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Armitage's response was chilling in its finality. "We seal this room, we burn the manuscript, and we pray to whatever gods may listen that it's enough to close the door that Blackwood opened." As they left the study, Holloway couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes. And in the back of his mind, he heard a faint whisper, a name that would haunt his dreams for years to come. Yidhra. Weeks passed, and the disappearance of Professor Blackwood faded from the headlines. Miskatonic University attempted to return to normalcy, but an undercurrent of unease persisted. Students whispered about the sealed room in the English department, and more than one faculty member abruptly resigned, citing personal reasons with wild eyes and trembling hands. Dr. Armitage had overseen the burning of the manuscript himself, watching as the ancient pages curled and blackened in the flames. Yet even as the last ember died, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. His fears were confirmed on a moonless night in late December. The librarian was working late, surrounded by stacks of arcane texts, when he heard it, a sound that could not exist in the rational world. It was the sound of pages turning, echoing from the darkest corners of the library's restricted section. With trembling hands, Dr. Armitage lit a lantern and ventured into the stacks. The temperature dropped precipitously as he approached the source of the sound, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. And there, on a shelf that he could have sworn was empty moments ago, sat a book. Its cover was made of some material that resembled human skin, and symbols that hurt to look upon were etched into its spine. As Armitage watched in horror, the book opened of its own accord, its pages flipping rapidly as if caught in a wind that didn't exist. "Impossible," he whispered, his scholarly mind warring with the evidence before his eyes. "I burned it myself." A cold alien voice responded, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Knowledge cannot be destroyed, old man. It can only be transformed." The pages settled, revealing text written in a script that twisted and moved like living things. And there, at the top of the page, was a name that sent a chill down Armitage's spine. Edward Blackwood's Ascension. As he read against his better judgment, Armitage felt reality shifting around him. The library's walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the flanks of some great beast. Shadows lengthened, taking on shapes that defied Euclidean geometry. The text spoke of Blackwood's journey through realms beyond human comprehension, of the price he paid for cosmic knowledge, and of the entity known as Yidhra, whose very existence warped the fabric of reality. But it was the final passage that truly shook Armitage to his core. "And lo, the seeker shall become the herald, opening the way for those who slumber in the spaces between. The stars align, the gates weaken, and Yidhra's children shall walk the earth once more." As if triggered by these words, a tremor ran through the building. Books tumbled from shelves, and in the distance, Armitage heard the sound of shattering glass. A realization, terrible in its implications, dawned on him. The burning of the original manuscript hadn't stopped anything. It had merely delayed the inevitable. And now, the seal was breaking. Dr. Armitage turned to flee, to warn someone, anyone, of the impending doom. But as he reached the library's entrance, he found his path blocked by a figure that both was and wasn't Professor Blackwood. It spoke, its voice a chorus of whispers and screams. "The way is open, Armitage. Will you join us in enlightenment or cling to your fragile sanity?" As tendrils of shadow reached for him, Dr. Armitage made a choice that would determine not just his fate, but potentially that of all humanity. Dr. Armitage's mind reeled as he faced the grotesque apparition that had once been Edward Blackwood. In that moment of crisis, a lifetime of esoteric knowledge crystallized into a single, desperate plan. "I choose neither madness nor enlightenment," Armitage declared, his voice steadier than he felt. "I choose humanity." With surprising agility for his age, he lunged past the Blackwood thing, snatching an ancient amulet from a nearby display case. The copper disc, etched with eldritch symbols, grew warm in his hand. The creature that was Blackwood hissed, its form rippling like a heat mirage. "Fool, you cannot stop what has already begun." But Armitage was no longer listening. His lips moved in a feverish chant, reciting words from a forbidden text he had hoped never to use. The amulet blazed with an unearthly light, pushing back the encroaching shadows. Across Arkham, others felt the disturbance. In her dormitory room, a young student named Sarah Marsh woke with a start, her dreams filled with visions of cyclopean cities and vast, starless voids. Without knowing why, she felt compelled to head towards the library. At the police station, Detective Holloway jolted awake at his desk, the name Yidhra echoing in his mind. The nightmares that had plagued him since Blackwood's disappearance suddenly felt all too real. As Armitage's chant reached a crescendo, reality itself seemed to waver. The Blackwood thing shrieked, a sound that shattered windows and sent books flying from shelves. It lunged at Armitage, tentacles of shadow extending from its ever-shifting form. But at that moment, Sarah burst into the library, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "Dr. Armitage," she cried, "I saw it in my dreams. I know what we have to do." The girl's presence seemed to strengthen the power of the amulet. The tendrils recoiled, and for a moment Armitage saw a flicker of humanity in the creature's eyes, a glimpse of the man Blackwood had once been. Detective Holloway arrived next, gun drawn, though he knew instinctively it would be useless against the horror before them. "What in God's name is happening?" he demanded. Armitage, still clutching the glowing amulet, spoke quickly. "The veil between worlds is thinning. Blackwood opened a door, and now something is trying to come through. Something ancient and terrible." Sarah nodded, her voice distant as if reciting from memory. "Yidhra, the Dream Witch. She seeks to remake our world in her image." The Blackwood thing laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "You understand nothing. Yidhra offers transcendence, an escape from the prison of human perception. Why resist?" But as it spoke, its form seemed to waver, the power of Armitage's amulet and the collective will of the three humans pushing it back. Holloway, his rational mind struggling to process what he was seeing, made a decision. He holstered his gun and stepped forward. "Tell us what to do, Doctor. How do we stop this?" Armitage's eyes gleamed with a mix of fear and hope. The manuscript was a key turning in both directions. What was opened can be closed, but it will take all of us. The price. He hesitated. The price may be high. As if in response to his words, the air grew thick with a palpable malevolence. Outside, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, and an eerie phosphorescent glow bathed the Miskatonic campus. The four figures in the library, Armitage, Sarah, Holloway, and the thing that had been Blackwood, stood poised on a knife's edge between salvation and doom. The next few moments would determine not just their fate, but that of all humanity. Armitage took a deep breath, the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Are you ready?" he asked his unlikely allies. "To close the door, we must venture into the very realm we seek to seal off. We may not return." Sarah and Holloway exchanged glances, then nodded grimly. The Blackwood thing watched with a mixture of hunger and fear, its form continuously shifting between human and something utterly alien. With a final, silent prayer, Armitage began the ritual that would take them beyond the bounds of known reality, into the heart of Yidhra's domain. The world dissolved around them in a kaleidoscope of impossible colors. Armitage, Sarah, and Holloway felt their very beings stretched and compressed, as if they were being forced through the eye of a cosmic needle. The Blackwood thing howled, its form splitting into 1,000 fractals before reassembling in patterns that defied comprehension. When the vertigo subsided, they found themselves in a realm that mockingly echoed reality. They stood in what appeared to be the Miskatonic library, but everything was subtly wrong. Books bled actual ink, their covers pulsing like living flesh. The ceiling stretched into infinity, where distant stars pulsed in rhythm with some unimaginable heartbeat. "Where are we?" Holloway gasped, his voice distorted as if heard underwater. Armitage clutched the amulet, which now burned cold against his palm. "The borderlands," he whispered, "the liminal space between our world and Yidhra's domain." Sarah's eyes were wide, drinking in the impossible geometries around them. "It's beautiful," she murmured, before shaking her head violently. "No, it's horrifying. Both. I can't—" "Focus!" Armitage snapped, though not unkindly. "We must find the nexus point, the spot where Blackwood first opened the door." As if summoned by its name, the Blackwood thing materialized before them. But here, in this realm, it was even less human. Tentacles and eyes sprouted from a form that constantly shifted, as if it couldn't decide what shape to take. "You fools," it gurgled, its voice a chorus of 1,000 tortured souls. "You've delivered yourselves to her. Yidhra comes." The very air seemed to ripple, and a presence made itself known. It was vast beyond imagining, a consciousness so alien that merely brushing against it threatened to shatter their sanity. Yidhra, the dream witch, had awakened. Holloway fell to his knees, blood trickling from his nose and ears. Sarah screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. Only Armitage remained standing, the amulet blazing with eldritch fire. "The nexus," he shouted over the cacophony of impossible sounds. "We must reach it." Through the haze of madness, Sarah pointed to a spot where reality seemed to fold in on itself, a singularity of pure wrongness. "There!" They struggled towards it, fighting against the very fabric of this twisted realm. The Blackwood thing tried to block their path, its form expanding to fill their vision. "Join us," it crooned, its voice now a seductive whisper. "Embrace the truth beyond human comprehension. Become one with Yidhra." For a moment the offer was tempting. The secrets of the universe lay bare before them, promising knowledge beyond their wildest dreams. Holloway's hand twitched towards the creature, his eyes glazing over, but it was Sarah who broke the spell. "No," she cried, her voice cutting through the psychic miasma. "This isn't enlightenment, it's oblivion." Her words seemed to energize Armitage. The old librarian thrust the amulet forward, its light carving a path through the chaos. "Now," he commanded. "To the nexus!" As one, they surged forward, pushing past the Blackwood thing. Its howls of rage followed them as they reached the singularity. "The chant!" Armitage gasped, his strength fading. "We must seal the breach, together!" Sarah and Holloway placed their hands on the amulet, and as one they began to recite the words Armitage had taught them. Ancient syllables echoed through the void, each one a key turning in an impossible lock. The world around them began to unravel. The Blackwood thing's screams reached a fever pitch as it was drawn back towards the singularity. In the distance, they felt more than heard Yidhra's roar of frustration as her chance at entering their world slipped away. As the final words of the chant left their lips, a blinding light engulfed them. The borderlands collapsed, reality reasserting itself with violent force. In that last moment, as they felt themselves being hurled back towards their own world, Armitage had a terrifying realization. The door was closing, but something still had to hold it shut from the other side. Someone would have to stay behind. In the fraction of a second that lasted an eternity, Dr. Armitage made his choice. With a strength born of desperation, he pushed Sarah and Detective Holloway through the collapsing portal. Their cries of protest were swallowed by the roar of reality reasserting itself. "No!" Sarah screamed. reaching back towards the old librarian as she felt herself being pulled away. Holloway, understanding dawning in his eyes, grabbed for Armitage's hand, but it was too late. The portal contracted, and Armitage's sad smile was the last thing they saw before a blinding flash hurled them back into their own world. They crashed onto the floor of the Miskatonic University library, the smell of dust and old books a shocking return to normalcy after the alien geometries they had witnessed. For a moment, all was silent, save for their ragged breathing. Then slowly they became aware of their surroundings. The chaos that had reigned earlier was gone. Books sat neatly on their shelves, the windows were intact, and the air no longer hummed with eldritch energy. It was as if nothing had happened. But the empty space where Armitage should have been told a different story. Sarah sobbed quietly, the weight of what they'd experienced and what they'd lost crashing down on her. Holloway, his detective's composure shattered, slumped against a bookshelf, his mind struggling to process the impossible events of the night. As dawn broke, painting the library in soft golden light, they realized the true magnitude of what had transpired. They had saved the world, but at a terrible cost. And they could never tell anyone the full truth of what had happened. In the days that followed, the disappearance of Dr. Armitage caused a stir in academic circles. Theories ranged from mundane explanations like early-onset dementia to more outlandish claims of alien abduction. Only Sarah and Holloway knew the truth, a burden they would carry for the rest of their lives. The Blackwood manuscript was never found, and the sealed room in the English department remained a subject of hushed whispers and wild speculation. Miskatonic University slowly returned to normal, the brush with cosmic horror fading like a half-remembered nightmare for most. But for Sarah and Holloway, life would never be the same. They met regularly, sharing a bond forged in the crucible of that impossible night. They pored over Armitage's notes, determined to stand vigil against any future incursions from beyond. And sometimes, in the dead of night when the stars aligned just so, they thought they could hear a whisper on the wind. A voice that sounded like Armitage, warning them to stay alert, for the door was not locked forever. For they knew now that reality was far more fragile than most could imagine, that just beyond the veil of the mundane world lurked horrors beyond human comprehension, and that there would always be those, like Blackwood, tempted by forbidden knowledge, willing to risk everything for a glimpse of cosmic truth. As for Dr. Armitage, his fate remained unknown. Had he been consumed by the eldritch forces he fought against? Or was he out there still, a lone sentinel holding the line between our world and the realms of madness? In the end, as Sarah and Holloway stood before Armitage's memorial plaque in the library, they realized that some questions were better left unanswered. For in the face of the cosmos's vast, uncaring nature, sometimes ignorance truly was bliss. But they would remember, they would watch, and they would be ready should the stars align once more and the whispers of Yidhra echo again through the halls of Miskatonic University. For the price of salvation had been high, but the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. The end